Well, this week we're in Mark chapter 14 as we conclude our Turning Tables series, and we're actually looking at the last two tables that Jesus would have been at in his life, the last 2 days before Good Friday, so Wednesday and Thursday of Holy Week. As Jesus was in Jerusalem, it says in Mark chapter 14 that it was 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. And we see later in Mark chapter 14 that Judas, one of Jesus's closest companions, was actually part of this plot. But the leaders had said that they didn't want to arrest him during the feast because there would be an uproar from the people. And so you get the sense midway through this week, like Jesus is really at risk and things are really in motion for Good Friday, where Jesus is crucified under the Roman authorities, and he's buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, and he rests in that tomb on Saturday, and then he's raised from the dead. He's resurrected on Easter Sunday. But when we think about these couple of days, Wednesday and Thursday of Holy Week, the tension is really high, and there's a whole lot of drama that is about to unfold as we get to Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But Jesus needed to find safe spaces really in the last couple of days. And it's interesting to me in Mark chapter 14, verse 3, it says that while Jesus was at Bethany, which is that town that we've been talking about up on the Mount of Olives, he was in the house of Simon the leper. As he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment and pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and she poured it over his head. And so if you think about the Wednesday safe house that Jesus would have been at, and if you think as these last couple of days of Jesus's freedom, life of freedom unfold, he spends these last evenings reclining at tables. That's what it says in verse 3 of chapter 14. He was reclining at the table. And then again, we get it in verse 18 that he was reclining at the table and eating on Thursday night as well. And so it's almost like in the final evenings of Jesus's last few days of total freedom, he finds these safe spaces so that he can be at a table with those that he loves most, or those that are closest to him. And when he's at Bethany, this house would have been a safe house on Wednesday night because it's the house of Simon the leper. Like, no Jews are coming out to a leper's house to eat that night. So Jesus is able to kind of be in the companionship, in the company of his closest people, closest friends. He's in a safe space. He's at the type of house and the type of table that he's been at for a multitude of years now, a couple of years as his public ministry has unfolded. And what we have here is this woman, and we think it's probably Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. She brings out this expensive flask of costly perfume, and she breaks it and she pours it over Jesus's head. And in verse 4, it says that some who were there said to themselves indignantly, "Why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. 300 denarii is like a denarii is like the equivalent of a day's wage. So this is like a year's salary that this woman breaks and she pours over Jesus's head. And in a culture like this too, it probably was likely that this was her dowry, or this was her bride price. Like, this would have been the gift given to the husband, or to the man who came courting and seeking her to be his wife. And you have this woman, taking this year's worth of wages, taking this kind of pledge to marriage, or this kind of exchange that would have happened in the midst of an engagement. And she breaks it and she pours it over Jesus's head. And everybody who's there gets upset. They're like, this was just a waste. Like, even in maybe their more noble moments, like, that could have been sold and it could have been given to the poor. Why was she so irrational? Why was she so illogical? Why was she so wasteful? Why was she so irresponsible? And you kind of get the feeling at this table as Jesus is reclining there, like, this is an odd moment. This is a strange thing to have happened. This illogical and irresponsible thing. But it's very consistent with what we've seen throughout Mark's entire gospel. This is yet another person giving it all to Jesus. All the way back at the beginning of Mark's gospel, when we started studying this, we started talking about guys like Peter who left their businesses, they left their families, they left their hometowns to follow Jesus. They gave it all, believing that they would gain it all in Christ. And we saw that with Matthew when he left the tax booth. We saw it with James and John when they left their dad in the boat. This woman, if it is Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, this woman is no different than those men. She gave everything, everything, all of her hopes of a marriage and a household and a family, all of her wages, her most prized possession, a year's worth. I mean, if you could just think for a second, like think of your annual salary, like how much you make in 1 year. That's what this was worth. She gave a year's worth of wages. Maybe her hope of marriage. And she put it all in Jesus. She put it all on Jesus, literally. And everybody around her is indignant. But Jesus, in this moment around the table, he says to her, he says, leave her alone in verse 6. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She's anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Everybody around thinks it's illogical and irresponsible. And Jesus looks at her and says, no, this is a beautiful thing that she's done. It never makes sense to give it all. It never makes sense to pay the price. The cost of living a larger story is everything. It costs everything to live a larger story. And it never appears to make sense. It always seems illogical. It always seems maybe even irresponsible until it's put in the context of Jesus's larger story. And that's what he says, wherever the gospel of my life and death and resurrection is proclaimed, what she has done will be told. In the context of Jesus's larger story, theological becomes beautiful. When we give it all to Christ, we gain it all in Christ. And Mary, just like Peter and the other apostles, was willing to give it all, to gain it all. Jesus says she's done a beautiful thing in the context of this larger story, because the illogical becomes beautiful in Christ's larger story. But if this is just Wednesday night, and this is kind of, it's strange to think about, but this is the last night that Jesus goes to sleep. After this meal on Wednesday evening, he goes somewhere, rests his head, and he sleeps through the night, and he wakes up on Thursday, and then he never goes to bed again. And so on this final night, he's saying some weird things like, you'll always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me. And I don't know if anybody would have really known. They know that the tension was high and the pressure was on, but did they really know that they wouldn't always have Jesus forever? Or when he says, she's done a beautiful thing, she's anointed my body for burial. Like, Jesus, what does that mean, that you've been anointed for burial? Like, we don't understand. And over the course of the next few days, as Jesus is crucified, it may have seemed like really all she did was pour that ointment on him so that he was anointed for burial. But by the time we get to Resurrection Sunday, and by the time Jesus raises from the dead, this thing that she's done becomes even more beautiful, because Jesus is opening the chapters of this much, much larger story that we're all a part of. But it might have seemed on that day, it might have seemed on that night, it might have seemed in that moment like it was a waste. Like it was a waste, because if Jesus' story is small, and if on that night he goes to bed having been anointed for burial, and then over the next few days he's killed and buried, and that's the end of his story, what would that have been like on Monday for Mary? It would have been a waste. A year's worth of wages, her hope of marriage and family. It would have seemed wasted if Jesus' story was small. It cost her everything to live into that larger story. And her faith was great enough, much like the faith of the apostles was great enough, to believe that if she gave it all to Jesus, she would gain it all in Jesus. And as we move to Thursday, the next day, so that was Wednesday's night at Safe House and Simon the leper's house. That was table story number 1. But in chapter 14, verse 12, it says that on the first day of unleavened bread, this would have been the Thursday of Holy Week, when they had sacrificed the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples said to him, where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And then verse 17 says that when it was evening, Jesus came with the 12, and as they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus started to speak to them about how one of them was going to betray him. And so what you have in Mark chapter 14 on this Thursday is the beginning of this celebration of the Passover. In the morning of Thursday, they would have sacrificed at the temple. The Passover lamb would have been sacrificed. You would have had pilgrims like the disciples that Jesus sends to prepare the meal. They would have had to go and purchase a lamb. They would have sacrificed the lamb. Then they would have gone to a place and prepared the feast that they were going to partake in that night around the table. This is all around what like Deuteronomy 16 verses 5 to 7 say. This all has to happen in Jerusalem. And so Jesus has to kind of go into the belly of the beast, so to speak. He has to go into the city to celebrate the Passover. And his disciples want to know, where do you want us to go? And how do you want us to prepare this? Because as soon as we step foot in the city, there's going to be some drama. There's going to be some tension. It's risky for us to go into the city, but we know we have to celebrate the Passover because of the way that Exodus 12 kind of lays out the feast and the celebration. They know that they're going to prepare the lamb. They know that they're going to have the feast. They know that they're going to remember the Exodus story, the story of a people who had been enslaved for hundreds of years, who cried out to their God. And God answered them by sending a deliverer. He sent them Moses. And Moses came and performed great acts of judgment on their oppressors. He performed great acts of judgment on the Egyptians. We know them as the 10 plagues. And eventually the Egyptians relent and they release the people of Israel out of their custody, out of their oppression. They're liberated, but the Egyptian army pursues them up to the Red Sea. And then God does this miraculous work where he opens up the Red Sea and the people pass through and they come through the other side. And as they come through the other side, the Egyptian army starts to pursue them, and God swallows up the Egyptian army in the Red Sea, and the people move on into freedom. And Moses, their liberator, their leader, their deliverer, eventually receives the law, and they begin to establish themselves as a nation in the wilderness before entering into the promised land. This great story of the Exodus was to be remembered every year. That's what Exodus 12 talks about. Every year the people were to bring a lamb to the temple and sacrifice it. Because on one of those great acts of judgment that God performed on the Egyptians, they had to kill a lamb and they had to put the blood of the lamb over the doorposts of their house so that the destroyer would know to pass over those households. And when we think about that celebration that night, it was a meal that they ate in haste because they were about to be freed. They were about to be liberated, and they weren't going to have time to sit on their heels. They were going to have to get moving. The Passover was this week-long celebration that began Thursday morning with the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, and then Thursday evening began the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, where there would have been these rituals within the meal, reminding them of this story. This was the celebration of the biggest story in their history. And that story wasn't just something that had happened. That was something that formed their identity. It's who they believed. In the midst of that story, God says, I will be your God and you will be my people. And so every year they remember this great story. And every year they're reminded that we are God's people. He is our God and we are his people. And Jesus sits down, and in the midst of this meal, this is what verse 22 says, that as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and he gave it to them. And he said, take, this is my body. And then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly, I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. Jesus was taking the elements of this celebratory feast and he was reframing them. He was in some ways, he was messing with the story. And messing with this story means messing with identities. And that can be tricky. And Jesus says over the midst of the bread and the lamb, he says, this is my blood, my body. I am a new Passover lamb. Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, he says that Christ is our Passover lamb. The author of Hebrews goes all, kind of into this in Hebrews chapter 12 and talks about how there were all these sacrifices that were made for all these times on a daily basis, a yearly basis, all of these sacrifices, but none of them could ever clear the conscience. None of them could ever completely clear away sin. But then one time, one man made one sacrifice, and that one sacrifice was sufficient for all men for all time. It's this great transformation of the story. It's this great reframing of the story. Jesus is like, you guys know the Exodus story, how God sent you a deliverer in the midst of your oppression, and how God performed these great acts of judgment. And you know how God redeemed you and brought you out and led you through with these miraculous signs and wonders. And you know how God shaped you and formed you into a nation. God is doing that again, and he's doing it in me. I am the new Passover lamb, and I am bringing forth a new covenant, and that covenant is the sign of a new kingdom that's going to come. It's a reframing of the Exodus story, but it's not just a reframing of Exodus. It's also a reframing of Genesis, like Paul writes in Romans chapter 5, verses 17 and 18. He says that sin, the whole reason we have guilt and shame and pain and all the hurt in our life, that sin came into the world through one man. It came into the world through Adam. One man's disobedience, one man's trespass brought sin and death into the world. But just as one man's sin and trespass brought it into the world, so one man's obedience, one man's faithfulness brings justification and life for all people. Jesus was saying, we don't have to do the sacrifices anymore. This is my body. This will be the last lamb you have to eat on Passover. Because I am a new lamb, a new sacrifice. And I am about to lay down my life for you. This cup, there would have been 4 cups in the midst of the celebration, all of them commemorating different parts of Exodus chapter 6, verse 6. These 4 cups, reminding the people of how God brought them out, reminding the people of how God executed judgment, reminding the people of how God delivered them, reminding the people of how God took them to himself to be his people. And Jesus says, this cup is the cup of my blood. It's the cup of a new covenant. It's not the blood of goats and rams anymore. It's the blood of a new lamb. This cup with the new blood, this new covenant language would have reminded Jesus' disciples about Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31. As soon as they heard Jesus say, this is the blood of a new covenant, they would have thought of Jeremiah 31:31 that says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Jesus pulls all this imagery from Genesis and Exodus and Jeremiah into this meal. He says, I'm a new lamb with a new covenant. And we're pointing forward to a new kingdom. The way that we relate to God is different because of Jesus. We don't have to go to the temple anymore. We talked about that. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. We don't have to offer sacrifices anymore. We don't have to bring our offerings to a priest and have them put do the butcher thing and slice out and kill all the blood and take it all out and cut up the meat for us. We don't have to do that anymore because Jesus has changed the way we relate to God. Jesus and the cross and the gospel are infinitely greater than Moses and the law and the Red Sea. Jesus is the mediator, the new covenant reality. And because of that, we have a different way of relating to God. We relate to God in this new kingdom around the table, just like Jesus was reclining at the table in these 2 safe houses on Wednesday night and Thursday night. At the table, Jesus reframes the past in the present for the sake of the future. It's almost like this great relay of faith was taking place at the table that night of the Last Supper. You see, kind of as a relay works, you see a runner come into the exchange zone and you see the next runner begin running. And at some point in that exchange zone, the baton is passed and the relay continues on. It's like all of the Old Testament stories, all of the promises of Genesis and Exodus and Jeremiah, all of these things were moving forward to this table. It was a reframing of the past in the present. They were all sitting there, and Jesus was making sure that the baton of faith was passed on to this group of people, these apostles, these people like Mary and Peter and those who had given it all to gain it all. He wanted to make sure that they caught the baton and that they were going to be able able to carry it into the future because a new, larger story was beginning. It cost them everything to live a larger story, but it cost Jesus the most. It cost Jesus everything for us to live a larger story. And this cosmic exchange zone is where the larger story begins. Our larger stories begin when we give it all to Jesus. We recognize that Jesus gave everything so that we could live a larger story. The table is free to us. It's free to us because it costs Jesus everything. You can't pay the price for the sins of the world, or you can't pay the price even for your own sins. It's like a restaurant bill that's beyond your means. Your credit card's maxed out and you ate more than you could handle. But someone else is taking care of the bill. Someone else has paid the price so that you and I could live a larger story. We can't pay the bill, but we can share the invitation to the table. We can make sure that everyone knows that a new lamb has brought forth a new covenant and is inviting us into a new kingdom. Yes, it cost us everything to live a larger story, but it cost Jesus everything to invite us into that larger story. And that was a price he was more than willing to pay. He knew it on that night as he entered the cosmic exchange zone with this group of apostles. And he said, "This is my body, and this is my blood. And it's being poured out for the forgiveness of many, so that everyone might know the Lord, so that everyone might know that they're invited to the table."